All working? Great. Hello, fuckers. How are we? How are we? It's a great honor. It's a great honor to be here giving the 21st of these wonderful lectures. I'm aware of who's given them before, and it is properly a who's who of branding. So it's a proper honor for me to be here. You say that when you do anything like this, and usually you're lying. But in this case, it really is an honor. So I've got a very strange career path that we should probably quickly step back and look at before we get into the topic of the talk. So it's kind of 30 years long, post-PhD, which is a frightening thing. And it splits into three connected but really rather different strands. So I finished my PhD and became a marketing professor in the States and then back here in the UK. Probably the highlight of my academic life was MIT. And I always taught brand management. And in all of those places, I introduced the brand management elective to the business school, which gives you some sense of what I'll talk about later, which is we haven't had formal brand management knowledge for as long as we might imagine. Yeah? It was always a question at LBS, is there really an elective in brand management? At Minnesota, where I started, do you really think there's a class in this, you know? And so even at Melbourne, which was not that long ago, 20 years ago, did we really want to add this to the syllabus? So you had to make a case for brand management, which is interesting. But certainly by the time I got to MIT, it was the time where students wanted to learn about brands, and that was my sort of, I guess my 25 years, but it slopes off towards the end. It was probably 10, 12 good years of solid academia, and then I slid into consulting. And I slid into consulting because that's where all the money was. LBS introduced me to money. I mean, not proper money yet, but more money than just being a lecturer. And it was interesting because after the money, there was suddenly this, what I would call Indiana Jones moment, where, you remember Indiana Jones in the original Raiders of the Lost Ark? He's sort of stealing archaeological stuff. And then the next day, he's in his lecture theater talking about it to the students. And there was this kind of magical synergy, doing work on brand management and then going and teaching it to MBA students and then writing about it. That seemed to be a magic triangle that almost all my colleagues who were, not completely, but a lot of them were largely afraid of going into actual real businesses, I think missed. And so I slid more and more into consulting, and my main client throughout those years was LVMH in Paris. And then much to my surprise, the third phase of my life that will see me out is about 8 years ago, I set up the mini MBA, a course in marketing, a course in brand management. At the end of this year, we'll train 42,000 marketers. So we're moving fast, and we continue to grow in about 40-odd countries. So it's been an interesting final stage, particularly in the sense that I've become a founder when I never thought I'd ever be one, and I've created a brand rather than work on other people's, which has been a great surprise. But across these three phases, the thing that I guess unites all of the phases is the concept of brand. There's a little starting point there where I wasn't doing brand. My PhD was in comms. I started out teaching advertising, but I can distinctly remember being into London Business School June 1999 and not having to teach until January and getting incredibly arseholed on a very regular basis. But you know, sometimes when you do that, it's also, other than being incredibly pleasurable, you have those moments of clarity sometimes when you're having a few too many beers. And what I kept thinking about during that sort of lovely summer of '99 was there was a gap, which was the branding gap. At the time, there was Cap Ferrer was teaching brand management in France, but there really weren't that many brand management classes or professors. And it seemed like that's where the action was. So I can remember it was quite a distinct strategic moment to go into brand. So what I thought I would focus on today is that topic of brand management, which has been that, for me, the 30-year period. Most of you know this, but just before we start, to make it clear, there's always been these two things in our world of branding. There's brands themselves, which are the raw material, right? Which is the the stuff you get given as a brand manager when you go in and you dig around a bit, and after 3 months you realize what you've got for good and for bad, the clay. And then there's the brand management, the thing we do with it once we're in charge of it. And I'm often interested how people conflate these two together when they're completely different things, yeah? And obviously you can draw a pretty interesting 2x2 grid of really beautiful, high potential brands being run by Muppets, but also some pretty small, interesting brands that are being really well managed for growth. And it's interesting when you pass those two things out, you begin to see far more dimensions to it all. Of course, over time, they tend to be connected. You know, good brands tend to eventually attract good brand managers, but not always. And one of the things I trained my MBAs to do very early was to separate out the brand from the brand manager, yeah? Because the two are not the same thing. And tonight, I just want to talk about management. We'll slip into a little bit of understanding brand equity from different perspectives, but it's more focusing on the business of brand management and the discipline of brand management as it's been practiced, okay? That's what we're going to look at. And depending which person you follow in the next 40-odd minutes, you can either argue we've been doing brand management for about 2,000 years, you can argue it's about 93 years, or the third and final option is 33 years. They're the three options, yeah? And you'll see where they come from pretty soon. Now, we're going to do our little soiree through the world of brand management by looking at a dozen notable experts on brand management. Scholars of diversity will note we're a little cock-heavy, as we used to say. When I used to populate discotheques many, many years ago, one of my friends would run downstairs to the disco and then report back. And he would often report back that it was sausage heaven, which was a way of saying, let's move on. So the world of brand management has very much been sausage heaven. It's been dominated, as you can see, by too many old, white, as far as we know, straight men. It's a tricky one, to be more serious about it, because in 2024, you really can't get away with this shit anymore. But it's a problem for me because I'm looking backwards, yeah? And backwards wasn't fair. So I thought long, I've had this problem before, and I do think about it quite a lot. We're looking at history tonight, an unfair, sexist, racist history. And I don't think we can really alter that. I could change and misrepresent it, but I fear I would do a disservice to the 12 I've picked, and also the people I'm trying to insert, who would pale into insignificance versus the ones who've genuinely risen to the top for unfair reasons. So I'm not going to put my finger on the scale. I'm going to give you the previous 100 years straight. But I'm going to make it very clear that we have to make sure the next century isn't as white and as male and as boring as the one that we've just passed. And I don't mean that in just a passing sense. When you study this stuff, and I've spent a couple of weeks, looking at the story of marketing and brand management, it's phenomenally sexist, right? We have like the godfather, the brandfather, the father of. And if I was a woman, it would really fuck me off after a while. Do you know what I mean? And as a bloke, I started to realize we need to be all committed, I think, that in 100 years' time, whoever's doing this talk, it'll be the 121st lecture, we need to be sure that list of we've just seen is properly diverse. And I don't mean that in a pat way. So yes, too many old white straight men. I can't do anything about history, but let's try and fix it from going forward. So the first of our old, dead, probably straight men, on which we'll tell this first part of the story. Aulus Umbricius Scaurus, who may not be the most familiar of the 12, but deserves his place for a couple of reasons. So, Scaurus was the Heinz of his day, basically, right? And he lived in Pompeii. He was an entrepreneur. He operated between 25 and 75 AD. He carked it. He died in the year 75, which was handy because I think Vesuvius was like 78 or 79. So he's a guy from Pompeii that didn't die from the volcano, right? But that's important because when the volcano hit, all of his stuff was captured forever. And so we've become recently aware of the fact that using mosaics, this guy was doing outdoor advertising. And he was doing outdoor advertising for a relatively successful brand. The first proper brand I think we can really look at. There's stuff about scrolls and other shit, but it's all a bit wobbly in my opinion. This is, as far as I can find, the first proper brand that was managed by someone, in this case, Scaurus. So why do I say that? Well, this is an ad, a mosaic ad. This isn't, saying something like, glory to Jupiter or something. What it's saying is the flour of garum made of the mackerel, a product of Scaurus from the shop of Scaurus. So this is fish sauce. Yeah, this is the stuff you put on anything at the time. And it was made from mackerel, as you can see. And what you see here is there was quite a bit of above-the-line investment going on. He'd vertically integrated from selling his now quite famous sauce to developing 7 shops. So we've got early omni-channel operation. He had scale. So the estimates, and I can't remember where I got this from, but he had about a 30% market share of the total marketplace in the surrounding area. And genuine global exporting. There's been evidence of Scaurus' product as far afield as northern France. So this was a brand by most markers, and it seems to be managed quite well by Aulus himself. And I think the final point here is, if I had to guess, why was Scaurus' brand so successful on that sort of list of things that drive successful brand? It was probably quality, but a very early precursor of quality, in the sense that I think we have forgotten in the developed world, in the 20th century for the most part, that brands' original purpose was to present a guarantee or a certification that the thing was not going to kill me. Literally. We didn't have any food standards. We didn't know who was making this shit. And the fact that you saw the signaling effect of Scaurus and his size and his scale suggested this may or may not kill me. But this is probably the least likely product to do that. And I'll tell you where I had that insight. Many years ago, I followed the England cricket team to Sri Lanka with a few of my friends. And we spent a frankly ridiculous 3-week period following the cricket team around beautiful Sri Lanka. And during that time we were there, Sri Lanka had a liquor crisis. There had been moonshine making of various liquor with alcohol that could literally blind you. And so we had an existential crisis inside the Barmy Army, which is, obviously we weren't going to do this sober. That was certainly not part of the plan. But there was a genuine risk we would blind ourselves by drinking alcohol. And so we had this sort of proper discussion about what were we going to drink on tour in order to not go blind, but also have a good time. And a few of us could remember one brand, which was Lion, which is a kind of a relatively famous Sri Lankan beer. And so we drank Lion for that whole tour. Again, not because of its symbolic elements or any of its flavor, but because it was the least likely product to kill us. And that's a true sad story, but also I think it's an insight into how brands probably began. All right, let's move on. Now we get to the middle date on my chronology, but certainly one that is a bit clearer. So this is Neil McElroy, and Neil McElroy definitely invented brand management. And you should know about this, and if you don't, it's one of the most amazing moments in business. So McElroy's a truly great man. He's going to go on and run NATO and do all kinds of amazing things for the American government. But in his early years, he's going to become the CEO of Procter & Gamble, and he's the reason P&G, to this day, is the greatest marketing company in the world. So he joins P&G age 21. He becomes very quickly the head of promotions in the 20s, and he spends particular amounts of his time promoting Camay. So remember back then, soap was a giant category, 100 years ago. And he works very hard on Camay, and you can see McElroy's fingers all over the advertising of its day. And although it's kind of quasi-editorial to our eyes today, and all very elegant and a century away, what you're seeing here is a sort of precursor to the modern P&G approach. So what McElroy did with Camay is a couple of things. First, he very clearly targeted women. Second, he focused on a very, very singular benefit, which was complexity. Which was complexions, not complexity. A beautiful complexion, which is what Camay would give you and which people would notice. And he basically said that over and over again, and then he also had a scientific reason to believe behind the claim. Scientists agree that Camay delivers the finest complexion. Now, again, to our eyes now, this is pretty rudimentary stuff, but compared to what had happened only 10 years earlier, this was a totally different league. And he got to a certain level with Camay, and then he kind of ran into a problem. And the problem he ran into was Ivory. Ivory's not a competitor, it's a sister. So Ivory is P&G's #1 soap brand of the time. It's gigantic, yeah? It's the biggest brand they've got. It was invented 40 years earlier than Camay. It's got a remarkably famous, now forgotten positioning of purity, yeah? 99 and 4400th pure is something that your great-grandparents would have known. And the proof point at the time, and I'm not making this up, that it's a pure soap is it will float, unlike other soaps. Its purity means it floats. And that leads to some very interesting advertising that to our eyes is a little off, but back then worked wonders. So here's it floating there happily with the 99 400th pure at the bottom. And then we get to this copy that, I don't know, it must have worked back in the day. This is literally 100 years old, right? But yeah, reaching for the floater because it's so pure. And they sort of shifted gears a year later, but it's going down a very, very interesting path. Because then you get to stroll up this gangplank sailor. I just don't know what's happening here, right? Anyway, it was a giant. And its giantness was a problem for McElroy for 2 reasons. The first reason was just internal focus and resources. Everyone was working in the soap division, and everyone was focused on Ivory. And it was very hard for him to get Camay any further down the road when at the end of the day, most of the operating time and focus and thinking was built around Ivory. And second, partly because of that, Ivory was able to go, well, that's working for Camay, we'll kind of start doing it as well. We'll start going after women as well. We'll talk about their hands. We'll kind of replicate it. And McElroy sort of had to do it because he was in charge of promotions. So McElroy realized that if P&G wanted to be more successful, it needed to do something that most modern companies haven't mastered. It had to allow multiple flowers to grow in different directions, at different times, with different resources, and learn to juggle, essentially, the invention of juggling, multi-brand management. And so what he did on May the 13th, 1931, is he wrote the McElroy Memo, the most famous memo ever written in marketing. And also something which ensures, because there's a date there, that brand management is very unusual in the managerial universe. We know the exact moment, 4:30, on May the 13th, when our discipline began. It began here. Yeah? And what McElroy does, he sits down his typewriter and he sends a memo, unusually for P&G, 3 pages. Normally it should be a page. A 3-page memo, and he sends it to the CEO of P&G. And the memo isn't just a symbolic thing. It's framed now in the Cincinnati headquarters of P&G. It's actually still a document that most modern companies could learn from because they're still not doing it as well as McElroy prescribed back in the day. So what you see at the heart of the memo is really an instruction to do 3, maybe 4 things. So the first thing, his first prescription, I'll have to read it from the screen here, hang on, is study the past advertising and promotional history of the brand, study the territory personally at first hand, dealers and consumers, in order to find out the trouble. So what he's saying, first of all, to brand managers, he's creating a role called the brand man, there we go again, Let's assume it's an abbreviation for brand manager, and just even though it's not. So the role of brand man begins with diagnosis, yeah? And it still does to this day, except it doesn't. We'll talk about it later. This is already very advanced for 21st century brand managers. We start with diagnosis, right? We start with the sore spot, with the market, working out what's going on. The next bit, after uncovering our weakness, develop a plan that can be applied to this local sore spot. It is necessary not simply to work out the plan, but to be sure the amount of money proposed can be expected to produce results. Outline the plan in detail. So now we get to strategy, yeah? Strategists in the Greek, yeah? We have our plan. Again, it's obvious, but it's missed by most companies. Tactikos, which in Greek means arrangement of things, is not here yet. This is strategios, which is the Greek word for general, yeah? This is the making of the plan before the arranging of the things. We get to the arranging of the things at the bottom, then prepare sales help and all of the necessary material for carrying out the plan. Tactical execution. And right at the end, which is delightful, keep whatever records are necessary, make whatever field studies are necessary to determine whether the plan has produced the expected results. Back to diagnosis, yeah? And I always have said to my client companies that don't do brand tracking, and there's a lot of them, on the very day that brand management was invented, tracking was part of it, yeah? And that's a great, great thing to have because McElroy knew what he was doing. And you get also the sense here that the shape of brand management is cyclical, is annual, yeah? Which again, it should be, yeah? It goes round and round. It doesn't go in a straight line. So here it is, the McElroy memo. So what do we acknowledge from McElroy's contribution, which is gigantic? First of all, for the first time, we have a formal role, brand man, brand manager. We have, for the first time, a whiff of brand architecture, the arrangement of brands, yeah, which will become, as we'll see later, probably the most important topic in brand management. Most companies have more than one brand, even back then. How do you arrange them in such a way you can be maximally successful? It seems such an innocuous topic, yet it's at the source of, in my experience, 80 to 90% of brand woes. Too many brands or badly arranged brands. So here we see for the first time someone doing something about it. We also, for the first time, glimpse what I would call the three-stage model that I have made the basis of my teaching and most of my consulting career. I see brand management as a three-stage process. Each step equally important to the other two, and each to be done in sequence. First, diagnosis, market orientation, market research, and crucially, segmentation. Most companies go wrong with segmentation because they think it's about them. It's not. It's got nothing to do with them. It's part of diagnosis. If your competitor is as smart as you, they could, in theory, build an identical segmentation to you. That would be correct, yeah? Segmentation is about the market. Targeting, the start of strategy, is about you and who you go after, along with, as we'll see later, positioning and objectives, okay? Getting a strategy then built from your diagnosis, and then tactical execution, our 4 Ps, etc. Yeah? So I see these as equally important. I also see them as being multiplicative, which is a polite way of saying if you fuck one of them up, you're fucked, yeah? It's no good if your strategy's wrong, having all the money in the world and the greatest execution, you're not gonna pull it off. It doesn't mean they have to be perfect, but it means if your diagnosis is off, everything else is off. We've got this case at the moment with the unfortunate CEO at Nike who's just been forced into retirement due to a whole series of silly decisions he made. The main reason, in my estimation, that he got himself into trouble was a couple, but he took over in the year right at the start of 2020. And what he did was he made the foolish assumption that this sudden spike in online sales caused by COVID was going to continue forever, and he extrapolated accordingly and went direct to consumer, when of course it bounced back to where it was before. His diagnosis was wrong, so everything else goes wrong after that. We don't see that very often even today. Yeah? I made up 2 words in my brand management career. The first one was tactification. And that's what normally happens, more often than not, because most brand managers don't do any diagnosis and don't have any strategy. They jump straight to tactics, yeah? And this isn't, it's a clumsy word for a massive problem, yeah? We don't have enough of the balance in place. And it gets worse because it's not even as if all brand managers are doing is product development and pricing and distribution and advertising. They're not doing that, right? All they're doing is advertising, the promotional P. One of the inane things about marketing is we've spent the last 25 years taking the original 4 Ps that were invented in 1960 and adding more Ps, right? Like Muppets, yeah? Presence, positioning, yeah? Purpose. You know, not even understanding the original work that went into this and just adding more Ps. There's one guy with 44 Ps, I shit you not, right? What we should have been doing, instead of inventing more Ps, where incidentally the probability of 2 or 3 more things all beginning with P actually being relevant is like 4,000 or 5,000 to 1. Never mind. Rather than fucking around with the Ps, we should have just executed the Ps, because now we've lost the Ps. Because while we were adding purpose and play and physical and all the other nonsense, what we lost was the rest of it. So if you look at the CMO survey that the US and London Business School now does here in the UK, when they ask CMOs, are your people involved with advertising? Well, yeah, more than 90% are. But when they ask them about innovation and product, the product P, 70% aren't involved anymore. Marketing people don't do product anymore. Pricing is exactly the same level here. Distribution falls to 7%. So this is a representative sample of big companies. This is proper stuff, right? There aren't marketers out there anymore. There's just advertising people for the most part, right? So when we say tactics, we mean the full suite. And finally, don't forget, what we also learn from McElroy is diagnosis, that it returns back to the start and off we go again. The initial phases of brand tracking. This was in place almost a century ago. Doesn't mean it's been practiced. P&G have had this ever since. As we'll see, it takes a while before the rest of us catch up, and some of us still aren't there. All right, so I'm shoving in Al Eichenbaum next. Very famous account planner in the Mad Men era, then went his own way and became a very successful marketing consultant. Not a brand specialist, but he's here for one particular reason. He has a definition that I think is the best one. And by that qualification, he gets into my list. And his definition, well, I'll tell you a story about Al Eichenbaum, it's kind of interesting. So he was born in about 1930 something. And when I taught at MIT, I always put this definition up like week 1 of my brand management class. And I started saying, I don't know when I started doing it, the late, great Al Eichenbaum. One of my class at the back put his hand up, and I said, yes, what is it? He said, he's still alive. I'm like, fuck, I'm sorry, right? So when I taught brand management again, the first thing I said was Al Eichenbaum, who's, must be in his 90s now, he's still going. And then another hand went up on the other side of the classroom and said, he's dead. So now officially dead, Al Eichenbaum for sure, 100% sure now. His definition was, I think, for me, it's the one that I took in my PhD studies, and I've kept it ever since. So, what distinguishes a brand from a commodity counterpart and gives it its equity is the sum total of a consumer's perceptions and feelings about that product's attributes, about how it performs, and about the brand name and the company associated with producing it. It's not easy, but it's good. And it's way ahead of its time, considering it's nearly 50 years old. So what's good about it? First of all, it sets up for me the eternal comparison of brand versus commodity, which is the intersection of where we must focus. Next, it was the first I can find reference that uses the concept of equity in its application to brand, something that will come up a lot more later. And finally, one other point, Eichenbaum is on already with this idea that it is all about the consumer and not about the organization, that the brand exists in the perceptions of the consumer. And finally, the holism is very apparent here. He's defining it as basically everything, which is also surely correct. So you really, I think, get, for me, a really good meaty definition that stands the test of time. What I boiled it down to, and I think it probably would change now, as we'll see later, was this formula. Brand minus commodity equals brand equity. You can take a brand, Coca-Cola, you can work out the commodity, carbonated beverage, and you can take the carbonated beverage out of Coca-Cola in the mind of the consumer, and if there's anything left over, is the concept of brand equity. Now, you can do that with awareness, you can do it with associations, you can do it with finance. You can, this is the principle by which brand valuation is done. I'm simplifying it somewhat, David, but at the end of the day, this is the heart of it. It probably changed a bit in my career 10 years ago with the revolutions we'll talk about later, into being slightly more bifurcated. And these days, what I say to all my MBA students is you have two jobs, right? If you want to build a brand. What is a brand? It's two things. It comes to mind, and it stands for the things you want it to stand for, yeah? That's it. And I like that very much, because we can overcomplicate the shit out of things. Rooms like this are full of that, right? At the end of the day, all you need to do to build a brand with all this complexity and discussion is achieve those two things. A lineal performance, that of your target market, how many of them bring it to mind when they're ready to buy? And then I believe also, when they bring it to mind, does it have those one or two things enough to push the consumer over the line to make the purchase? I truly believe that's it. Now, that simplicity of construct becomes very complex to achieve, but I really like the simplicity in the middle of the complexity to help us out. But that's Eichenbaum. Okay, now we get into the end of the 60s. So Reese and Trout, both working for GE. Reese sets up his own agency and gets Trout to come across. They write an article about positioning. It turns into a book, and it becomes the book of the 1970s. Yeah, they're always holding like a skull, and it's all here in the brain and all that. But this was the breakthrough theory of brand and marketing for the 70s. Positioning, the battle for the mind. There's three lovely little direct quotes I want to use here to illustrate what this work was good at. First of all, a product is something made in a factory, a brand is something made in the mind. Stephen King stole that. These guys said it before him. Just making that point. So again, the idea that it's perceptual. The essence of positioning is sacrifice. You must be willing to give up something in order to establish that unique position. So that's way ahead of Porter as well, right? This, for me, is one of the great insights for modern positioning, as we'll see. And finally, the basic approach of positioning is not to create something new, but to manipulate what's already there in the mind, to retie the connections that already exist. Straight out of the Frankfurt School, we're not going to create attitudes. We're going to reinforce those that already exist. So, what do we get from this work? We get a lot of very important things. It still stands the test of time. Brand before advertising. Up until this book, it was all ad guys like Eichenbaum talking about how to advertise brands. This is the first one that precedes advertising and has a theory. Again, the priority of it being consumer perception, the focus, the sacrifice, the repetition necessary for success, occupying a unique first place in the perception of the consumer, and then working with what's already there. I think there's a lot in this work, and particularly these two things are missing. We could learn now. I'm a huge hater of unique. We'll get back to why later. But this bit here could fix a lot of brand management problems right now. All right, our first living guru, as far as I know. John Murphy, founder of Interbrand, originally called Novotech. Was it, Dave? Do you remember? Novamark, thank you. Originally called Novamark. So it was a naming firm, basically, with a few feet dangling into design. But when you do naming, you have to get into the legal stuff as well. So by 1979, it had got international and become known as Interbrand, and Murphy was growing fast. He was working on hobnobs. So hobnobs have a strong link into brand management. Murphy had been working on this great brand called Hobnobs, which was owned at the time by Rank Hovis McDougall. And in 1987, while he was working on the Hobnob stuff, an Australian company called Goodman Fielder made a bid of £1.7 billion to acquire Rank Hovis McDougall. Now, at the time, that was a huge amount of money, but it wasn't. Because without going into enormous amount of accounting detail, if you hadn't recently acquired a brand, you couldn't account for it on the books of the organization. So in effect, Goodman Fielder were getting a massive bargain, because at the time, Rank Hovis McDougall owned pretty much many of the great British household brands. So it was a bit of a crisis. And Murphy famously sent a fax to his client saying, I can put a value on each one of your brands to show that £1.7 billion is way short of what it should be. And Murphy did what all good consultants did. When the client came back and said, we want you to do that, he went, oh, fuck, how am I going to do that, right? It's one of the great skills of consulting. Fuck, what? Okay, how would I do that then? Okay, interesting. He pulled off a methodology that was enough to actually prevent the acquisition. Interbrand expands its business, not just doing naming now, but realizes valuation. And we now get, of course, the most famous document in branding, which is the Interbrand top 100 most valuable brands. There are, of course, two other fine firms in this triumvirate of valuation now. We have Brand Finance, the best, of course, of the three. Brand Z, now owned by Kantar, formerly Millward Brown, but all ostensibly doing the same thing, working out the value of a brand. Again, back to our formula from before. So why was this so important? It gave us a book value for brand, and that got us a ticket into the rest of the organization. Without this, brand was still largely deemed to be bullshit. It made brand a thing. Yeah? It made it finally, I think, an endorsable concept. It fits perfectly our equation from before, but now putting dollar numbers on it meant we could compare across categories, and it became a crucial tool for M&A. Whether we wanted to sell our brand for a good price or we wanted to prevent being acquired for a bad price, we were suddenly able to do this properly, and it became a very legitimate, to this day, tool. It also, and David can shout at me later, it also potentially had something that didn't transpire. 20 years ago, we all got very excited because Martin, if you remember, WPP got very excited about brand valuation because they had this vision that we would have a value for a brand and we could just speak to the whole board rather than the stupid, powerless marketers. And we could get the boardroom to invest huge amounts of money because we could show them all the levers and all that. None of that ever happened, right? It was the dream that never transpired. It gave the three firms tremendous PR value because every year they can produce one of these using external data. But it also opened them up to a little bit of criticism in the sense that when you legitimately do a valuation, all of this applies. When you do an estimate based without more firm data, the variation between the three firms is extreme, sometimes in the billions of dollars, yeah? Which suggests that at least one, if not two, of the firms are way off. And when I used to write about this, it became the same article every year. I'd point out maybe one of the three clocks is telling the right time. We just don't know. And then this crazy Swiss firm got hold of me and said, actually, we've got a global record of every price paid for every brand in the world for the last 10 years, and we can compare it to what the three firms said was the actual price it was worth in the year when it was bought. And that wasn't too good either. It was. Now, again, to be fair, you have to draw a big line between these slightly bullshitty estimates of valuation and what these firms do when they actually get underneath the hood. But nonetheless, this was a huge moment in the development of brands. Now we get to one of the two kind of giant figures, I think, of our story, David Archer. It's very interesting to me. Archer has largely lost his impact on any brand manager under the age of 30. They literally have never heard of him, which is a stunning revelation given he was it. certainly in my early studies. So 54 years a professor at Berkeley. He'd not been a brand specialist until about 1988, which is important because he'd done marketing and research and strategy. He'd never specialized. And then he attends the MSI conference where, what do you know, just like today, they needed an answer to the short-termism that was destroying marketing. And so off goes Arca into the world of brand and writes the two most famous books of the 20th century. He writes Managing Brand Equity in 1991. The first time outside of P&G we had a proper manual. It was beyond communications now. And we got the first glimpse of this idea. There were these two slightly different components. The cognitive brand awareness multiplied by the more semantic brand image. And crucially, all the organizational advantages of what a brand would bestow on a company if they strengthened it. This was all brand new. Then he followed up in 95 with Building Strong Brands. Again, pushing the idea now that this wasn't the job for ad agencies. This is what brand internal people do. And he produced the brand identity model. Now, I think as great as Arca is and was, this is a real source of current problems. So this is his model from the original book. I think it's been tweaked a little bit since. Up at the top, the analysis part is spot on. But the rest of it is very, very, very circuitous and over-complex, in my opinion. And if you look at what most companies are struggling with now, I think we can draw a red line back to all of this stuff here, right? So we have brand as product, brand as person, brand as organization, value prop, the relationship, the position, etc. It's too much, yeah? It's too much. And we've lost that sacrifice concept that Ritson gave us. Where we have to be impressed, however, was the fact that we got the brand architecture spectrum. At the time, he called it the brand relationship spectrum. It doesn't matter. This is, you know, for us, this is our everything in terms of, there's nothing new here, but it was, I call it the Rosetta Stone of brand management, because before this point, we all had different names for the different things we were doing, and suddenly we had a common language, and it was all there to be seen. I used to train my MBA students. I would say Prince, who was still alive at the time, sang there were 22 positions in a one-night stand, and there were 22 positions in the brand relationship spectrum. There aren't, but it was a nice gag at the time, right? But what's lovely about this, anyone who works in brand consulting, it gave us the lingua franca by which we could go to work and became the dominant thing. Huge, it was huge. But if you ask me, and we'll talk about this at the end, what's wrong with brand management at the moment, I think the central problem is positioning, which is incredibly out of touch. And I think a lot of that blame can be laid, not having a go at the great man, but, well, I am, I suppose. This has caused a lot of damage. And I think if we'd have had a bit more recent Trout, or maybe they'd come after, we'd be in better shape. You know, as airporty as their work is, it's an airport book, right? But inside there is some really strong thoughts. Okay, let's keep going. Kevin Keller, Duke PhD, but then crucially goes to Berkeley, works with Arca, becomes essentially the inheritor of his theory. This book brings back chills. This is what I taught with when I started teaching brand management. This was our first, and still is, the greatest textbook on branding. Arrived at the turn of the century. If you study brand management, you will know this or one of its other 4 editions. It gave us structure, proper structure. It gave us, and this is a very interesting moment, the consumer-based brand equity model. And so we'll come back to it in a minute, but basically this is at the time what people like me studied. This model of you build salience, but then you get to a cognitive and emotional image, then you get to judgments and feelings, and then at the top there's sort of loyalty and engagement. And I think this model has been largely disproved, but it was so dominant in the 90s and noughties, this is where we all came from. His other great moment was the brand report card. It was a Harvard Business Review article, but it was great and remains great. The 10 things you have to do to manage a brand well, it's still 100% correct, 100% applicable. Keller knew his stuff. I learned one other thing here that's worth noting. If you ever read Keller's first edition, it's a kind of a masterpiece. It's tight and it's great. Last summer, I sat down with it was the 5th edition, and it's a real big pile of dog shit, yeah? It took me about 100 pages to go, this is a pile of dog shit. There's no narrative. It's all over the place. But of course, what happens is you release these books, and then the publishers take over, and they add, and they add, and they add. And for me, it was a huge lesson for Mini MBA. We were starting to do the same, like sticking little bits in here and there. So we just ripped it up and just redid the whole thing, which is much harder to do, but stops your thing turning into a big bag of shit. Okay, here we go. You ready now? We're getting close to modern time. So, Byron Sharp. So Byron Sharp is the first of these guys that's my peer. Like I know Kevin, and I've met David, but they were like, Byron and I are the same age. We can remember each other 30 years ago, right? Like having a go at each other 30 years ago. So I called him the Dark Lord of Penetration. I don't think he dislikes it. The obsession with total penetration of the market. But much as we joke, the impact of Ehrenberg Bass is and continues to be gigantic. Not just in the way it's starting to influence practice, but it has reversed things completely that seem to be irreversible. And I see this as very much just the start of their impact. So the Red Book begins it. What does the Red Book tell us back in 2010? The main lesson, Salience über alles. Yeah? It's about coming to mind. And you go back to that pyramid, there was salience sort of creeping along the bottom. Oh, tick, we got salience. No. Your image and your relationship with the brand. Are you in love with the brand? Is the brand in love with you? Are you kissing each other at night, It was all a load of bollocks, And we all got carried away with, Harley Davidson tattoos and all that. Everyone's got a tattoo of their favorite brand. I have a relationship with this brand. I'm loyal to this brand. It was anthropomorphic nonsense. And we needed this focus on, does it come to mind in buying situations? Yes or no? And that's mostly it. That's a massive change, yeah? That's a massive change. So in the old school American model, we had brand awareness, which if you think about it is a very odd metric, yeah? Unfortunately, Ehrenberg Bass are entirely correct. When you think about donuts, which donuts come to mind? It's a stupid question, yeah? The consumer doesn't start with donuts. They start with, it's morning break time and I need a snack, yeah? We had it wrong all this time, yeah? And we made it a gateway variable to this bigger, more interesting, nonsensical thing of image and relationship. You look at where Salience sits there, it's a minor thing. So the modern world of brand management post-Ehrenberg Bass is basically Salience. I'm in the minority, I think, of believing there still is a role for brand image there. But I would probably I would be shouted down by most of the Ehrenberg Bass believers and disciples that it's just mostly Salience. Why is it going that way? Well, first of all, it's a better, more complex metric. The Q is now the category entry point, right? It's break time and you're hungry. What comes to mind? That's a more market-oriented metric. And also it captures much better the key insight of the last decade. Consumers don't give a shit about your brand, yeah? It's absolutely the central premise for managing brands better. When you spend 8 hours a day on a single brand, at some point you go native. You start thinking that people give a shit about your purpose, yeah? That people have room for a personality and characteristics and attributes and purpose and feelings and relationships and a rhomboid and an onion and all that jazz, yeah? You've lost the plot, yeah? What we learn when we accept that the consumer, not the brand manager, has 9,000 brands and thinks about yours for 3 seconds a year, is if you're lucky, you have 2 jobs. You need to come to mind in buying situations, and in my opinion, you also maybe have 1 or 2 brain cells where once you come to mind, you're this, or you might be that, okay? That's it. There is no doubt that's true, yeah? And we have to bring organizations to this clarity. Because at the moment, if you look at positioning, it's a total shit show, yeah? We have brand managers who don't know their own position without the assistance of PowerPoint, yeah? Too many concepts, too many words, none of it's working. And I'll show you a notable example in a minute. Final point, salience drives consideration, and your brain plays tricks on you. If the brand comes to mind, you're already starting to realize it's the best one. You don't play the deck of your brain fairly. You're predictably irrational. If it's come into your mind, you're already making arguments for it before your conscious brain is aware of it. So salience is, to some degree, consideration, preference. I do like the work of Kantar in this area, though, who make it very clear that when you start a brand in its early years, you need difference and more brand image. But later on, when you're mature, yes, salience is the big driver. I think that's a very interesting finding. All right, so what else does Sharp give us? Category entry points, which are key to the concept of salience. Distinctive brand assets sort of get mentioned, but we'll leave it for Jenny in a minute to pick that up. And then the other one, distinctiveness over differentiation. Yeah? Differentiation doesn't exist in the Ehrenberg-Bass world. It does, but it's low-level shit like big and small and red and blue. It's like a, can't say retarded, like a second division kind of differentiation, yeah? And finally, the other great construction, sophisticated mass marketing. Huge concept, yeah? There is no doubt, as you look at the data, that if you want to build a brand and you can afford it, you want to go after everyone in the category. Now, the sophisticated means not literally everyone in the UK, everyone that could buy in the category. And if you can define that and afford to reach that group, it is clear that the day of segmentation is over for brand building. Those nice pictures of a woman looking out of a window and a chap shaking hands and a guy with gray hair worrying about his pension and all that shit, right? It's all horseshit. Yeah? It's total overcomplicated horseshit. We all did it and it's pointless. If you can afford to do it for the brand level, you want to build a brand to the whole market, the whole potential market. And again, it's a revolutionary concept, and it more and more as the years go on proves to be correct. The marketing science thing, that's horseshit. Marketing's not a science. We've already had this debate. I'm old enough I was in the States when we had the debate last time. There's a brilliant Journal of Marketing paper that says, never mind whether marketing is a science, who cares? Science is marketing. And their point is, if you look at paradigms and the social construction of science, it moves in waves with socially agreed groups who market their ideas better than some other group. And that's ironic because Ehrenberg-Bass is on the precipice now of taking over, of becoming the dominant approach, which I think is a good thing because I think it's an improved approach. And we have to remember what Ehrenberg-Bass have gradually done, which is strip back the nonsense of the 90s on brand. We were all smoking too much of our own crack, metaphorically speaking, yeah? We fell in love with this complex emotional nonsense. We got too carried away. And Ehrenberg-Bass probably went too much the other way, but they're taking us back to a more accurate, practical place. Well, they are here. I just came back from the States where there's still a lot of metaphorical crack smoking still going on. And then we get a field and Binet. I know Peter did the talk 2 years ago. For me, as important as Byron in their contribution to thinking. So both Oxbridge, one Cambridge, one Oxford, off to agencies they went, brilliant statisticians, and really it gets cooking. They get their hands on the IPA data bank, start running an extraordinary amount of analyses of advertising effectiveness here in the UK, and they are very talented statisticians. And irrespective of what they've done for advertising effectiveness, which is huge, their impact on brand management is also huge. My only criticism of the boys here is they called their book The Long and the Short. And it allows people to think, because no one really reads books, right? They go, oh yeah, the long, I get it. Some stuff is long and some stuff is short. Yeah, I get it, right? That's partly it, right? But the long and the short of it and the other monographs are way bigger than that if you actually properly sit down with them. So yes, there's communication which is long and which is more about brand building. And there's communication which is short and which is more about short-term sales. That's scratching the surface of what Field and Binet have discovered. So one is obviously brand and the other is performance. One is top of funnel, the other is bottom of funnel. One is about changing memory structures. The other is about asking for some behavioral activation or response. One is much better served with emotion. The other does better, for the most part, with more rational arguments. One is about your brand position, and only your brand position, yeah? It's about the 2 or 3 things you want to say, yeah? Salience plus we're this and we're this. The short is about a particular old-fashioned style product position to a particular segment with particular advantages. For me, the key lesson, as we've already said, brand is absolutely about sophisticated mass marketing. It's about going after everyone. But when we get to short, it absolutely still speaks to segments, to target a particular segment with a particular offer. This should be a 20 to 30-year mission. Obviously different executions, but done without much change over time. We could be doing 100 of these a year, yeah? Multiple digital communications at different segments at different times with different products. Completely different timeline. And of course, our other big challenge, we need econometrics, and even then it doesn't really speak to this, to prove their worth, but this is straight ROI stuff. So for me, the long and the short is a lot bigger than long and short and answers many of our major challenges. And here's the other thing about their work. It's actually fucking had an impact, yeah? This is Grace Kite's slide from the IPA showing that the publication in 2013 of the long and the short of it actually, okay, causality here, but actually did change the balance of submissions, at least to the IPA case studies. I think it had an impact. I think it worked. It managed to show some organizations the fallacy of spending too much on performance marketing. Again, it depends who you talk to. In the US, we have almost no impact at all, it seems, reference to long and short. But in the UK, it's proven to be an influence. And I think with the Nike case, we have a perfect illustration of why they all need to read the long and the short of it. All right, nearly at the end. Whew, Jenny Romaniuk. Ehrenberg Bass for 21 years. Her impact really kicks in about 10 years ago. She's written more recently Better Brand Health, which I think is all starting to cook and change the nature of brand measurement. But it is this magnificent opus that we must refer to here, Building Distinctive Brand Assets. So at the core of understanding salience and distinctiveness, to use Professor Sharp's brilliant phrase, we need brands to look like themselves. Now, you think, well, it's obvious. Why wouldn't a brand look like itself? Because brand managers overcomplicate it, get bored, too creative, agencies, you know, everything. Yeah? You get bored. And as a result, you make the brand not look like itself because you look at it for 8 hours and you forget that the consumer looks at it for 3 seconds. So distinctive brand assets are a key part of this and a huge part of brand management. And Jenny's work covers making these DBAs a central premise, bigger than the positioning itself, if you understand it. Measuring it through the famous Romaniuk 2x2 grid. What I would give to have a 2x2 grid as famous as this shit, right? This is like eternally there, right? This is the Romaniuk grid. It sounds like it's going to fix everything, right? Making a selection on the types of distinctive brand assets, building the palette, as she calls it, and then applying it to make sure you achieve distinctiveness. This is the easiest and most efficient thing most brands should be working on, yeah? Working out their distinctive brand assets, logo +3, +4, and then executing the shit out of it. Remember that 84% of ads are not remembered or attributed to the brand that did the ad the next day among the audience that saw it, yeah? That's why we need distinctive brand assets, because most people don't know it's you. So there's our list, okay? Now, the obvious question is, my obvious question is, where the fuck am I here? Yeah? And the answer is, I have to be honest, I don't make the list. I know I don't make the list, right? If anyone else was doing this presentation, I wouldn't make the list. But I'm doing the presentation, so I'm gonna make the list, okay? It's my talk, so I'm in there as number 13. And so how would I rate myself in the contribution to brand management? Pretty highly, I have to tell you. So before I finish, I want to talk on two things. What I think my contribution is, please look at my contribution. And then, we can laugh at that. And then, let's just talk about the future, and then we'll finish with questions. So, where have I made a contribution that squeezes me kind of in the little cracks between these 12 great thinkers? First of all, market orientation. I did not invent it, but I think I have operationalized it over the last 10 years, and when everyone else had forgotten about it. It was a great topic of the early 90s that we forgot about. But it's a forgotten literature. And I talk to clients about doing a 180, which is instead of looking at customers, turn around and see how customers look at you with actual data. And you learn your brand is unimportant, yeah? You learn that you're not distinctive. You learn that your competitors are not the companies you thought. I've been through that 100 times with clients. They give me a list of competitors. They go, that's really interesting. Look, when we do proper research, none of these guys turn up. And all these other guys over here that you haven't listed, they turn up, yeah? It's funny, and the word competitors, it isn't even relevant. Customers don't say competitors, they say alternatives, and they come out of different categories. So the minute you do market orientation, it starts to explain why Ehrenberg Bass have got so much right. How brands are perceptions, and why brands are such little things. Not to you, the brand manager, but to the consumer that just thinks it's toothpaste, yeah? It's a crucial point. Not because I want to make everyone feel depressed, because you're fundamentally worthless, and your brand's fundamentally worthless, but because it's only by realizing your brand is a little thing through market orientation that you'll manage it better. Salience is a great example. Your brand is always salient. That's all you ever fucking think about, right? But it's not for the consumer when you do the 180, and suddenly salience becomes the main goal. Brand strategy is 3 questions. We've already talked about brand strategy. I came to this realization only about 10 years ago. So it's a very uncomfortable thing as a professor of many years to realize I know nothing about this. So I really studied strategy late in life because I started to have to do strategy for really quite scary big brands, and I didn't know anything about it. And I first learned about strategy, general strategy, about avoiding tactics, yeah? About taking time, about being choiceful, and through the choices, making sacrifices, because what you don't do is more important than what you do. And then ultimately the von Clausewitz thing, about the beauty of a simple thing. That true skill is the ability to make something seem so simple to your team or your army that they give you the ultimate compliment. They say to you, it's kind of obvious. And you go, yeah, it is kind of obvious. Go and fucking do it, yeah? It's the thing consultants don't do. They overcomplicate the shit, yeah? Anyone can position with 17 slides. On one page, it's a much more skilled operation. And then it comes down to 3 things. I know this to be true. We have so many strategists, and it's never been more complex than right now, right? It's so unclear. They're so full of their own shit, it's unbelievable, right? Such a precious nonsense, yeah? All brand strategy is answering 3 questions. Not even correctly. The bar is so low. Just answer the 3 questions, yeah? You'll be in the top 10%. I'm not exaggerating, right? Question number 1, who are you targeting? We know from the work of Better Briefs, in the UK, the biggest brands, when the agency comes out of the room having been briefed by the client company for 2 or 3 hours about their strategy, only 1/3 of those agencies know who the company is targeting at the end of that 3-hour briefing, yeah? That's an actual empirical data point, yeah? 2/3 of British companies can't even explain to their agency who they're going after, yeah? That's not a problem of briefing, that's a problem of strategy. And it's complex now because you've got mass marketing, define the mass market. You've got what I would call prosaic segments. Who are they, right? We need to answer the question. Positioning, absolute total shit show, right? I don't know of any brand with the exception of Kit Kat that has got this right. Too much, too much, too much. Too many concepts, too many words, nonsensical words, the consumer champion. What, right? We've lost the plot here. Positioning is not clear. And then objectives. We know this from research. A handful of objectives per brand, 3, 4, 5. Any more than that, they stop working. Expressed as a SMART or an OKR, measurable benchmark. Again, We know from the Better Briefs work that about 85% of the briefs they receive from client companies don't have any clear objectives. If you can have these three things, you have a brand strategy. Next, two-speed targeting, an answer to that marketing challenge. I believe it's totally clear that if you want to build a brand, and you can afford it, a big if, you should go after everyone in the category. You should dispense with segments. I think Aaron Bogbass are correct. If you can afford to do it, you should target everyone. But you must define what is the sophisticated part. This is where P&G are doing really rather fantastic work. It's not obvious within the circle of the British population what the rectangle of the sophisticated mass market is. You have to define that for clarity reasons. But it's equally clear that once you've done that, when you're doing performance work to promote products, you should target specific segments. Again, not those over-complex segments with lovely psychographic names, prosaic segments, like haven't visited my website in a week, yeah? Like used to buy, don't buy anymore. Simple, basic segments that we can activate and go after with a particular offer. Relative differentiation. I buy into distinctiveness. I totally accept it's our main goal. I haven't given up on differentiation, but I believe in relative differentiation. What does that mean? I'm taller than David Haig. David is 5'10"? Taking it? 5'10". He's 5'9". I can tell the way he said that. Look at me. You're 5'9"? He's like, yeah, okay, you're not 5'10". He's 5'10". I'm 6'1", right? I am taller than him. That does not mean I have invented height, yeah? It does not mean that David does not have height, yeah? Height is not some unique thing I have discovered on the way here, yeah? I have more of it than him. I am relatively different than David on height. That was the whole point of differentiation. At some point, Porter or someone else went, to be different, you have to be unique. It literally is a different thing, yeah? So aim for relative differentiation. Aim for the one or two things where you can be relatively more to the market. Now, note something. You may not be more. It helps if you are. But if you say it more, and you say it more creatively with more money more often, and you focus upon it, you will achieve it. That's the point of relative differentiation. Porter was wrong. It's not about being unique. When you position for relative differentiation, you can only have two concepts. One for your distinctive brand assets, which are a big part of this, and one for whatever you want the thing to be. Height, weight, whatever it is, right? And then here's the hard bit. You've just got to go after it 20 or 30 years to get its full effect. Professor Sharp keeps saying brands aren't different. And he's right, most of them aren't. It's not because the concept of differentiation isn't possible. It's because it's really fucking hard and only a few brands get it. But there are brands that have got it. I believe Kit Kat is the greatest positioned brand on the planet, yeah? And all it has, it took me 4 years to get them to let me see their positioning because I could smell how good it was. And all they have is 4 words. Kit Kat believes breaks are good for you, but it's really just one word, breaks. And then there's the 4 distinctive brand assets. That's it. And the skill is not adding to the shit. It's preventing any more shit being added to it, yeah? And they've managed to do it. That's why they're so well. Now, that's not unique, being, you know, a break brand. We've got cruise lines going for it. Cadbury Flake went after it for years with the woman in the bathtub, remember? They have an equally legitimate claim. But Kit Kat said it longer, better, with more money, yeah? With more creativity, with more focus. They focused product development on it, distribution upon it, and they became it because of it. That's the high bar of relative differentiation. And it's available only to the great brands. And it runs alongside distinctiveness, not against it. Disruptive consistency. When I worked for LVMH, I worked for some of the world's greatest brands. And it became apparent to me as I worked for them that when you studied a really fantastic brand, there were 2 motions going on at the same time. The first motion was these brands were completely true to their DNA. It was almost like an organic thing. Some of them were 100, 200, 300 years old. They just did shit that was, they just knew how to do it. It was like muscle memory, yeah? They just were pure. But at the same time, the stuff they were doing was completely disruptive to the category. And so there was this kind of paradox, which my French bosses love, because French people love a paradox. I can't resist it, right? Instead of paradox, they love a paradox. Consistency and disruption going in the same fashion. I'll give you a good example. I don't know if it's a secret still, but it won't be very soon. So Dom Perignon, where I spent many happy years working, Dom Perignon invented champagne, et cetera, et cetera. Dom Perignon 2003 harvest sucked, yeah? I'm not sure I should be saying any of this, but let's say it anyway. It was terrible. So terrible that Vincent, the cellar master, is making no wine. I reckon that's 400 million quid gone, right? And Dom Perignon is special because it's vintage only. It doesn't have, unlike every other champagne brand in the world, it has no non-vintage. You know when James Bond goes, I'll have the Dom Perignon known in 54? It's because the 54 is different from the 53, and there is no general Dom Perignon. So they're going to walk away from 400 million pounds worth of revenue because Vincent doesn't think it's good enough, right? And they're vintage only. They're the only brand in the world that would ever do that. Why do they do it? Because they're vintage only, yeah? What have they done? They've just completely disrupted the whole world of champagne. That's what great brands do. They break the rules to be true to themselves. And I think that concept in execution has lots of meat. Linked to it is code play. I give everything to Jenny. When she was developing distinctive brand assets, I was working in fashion. Doesn't look like it, I know, but I was. Well, this is a true story. When I went to work for Dior in France, the boss of Dior, when I walked into his office, said, "You must be good," right? That's literally what he said to me. Moving on. It's a fashion joke. It's a fashion joke. That really happened. I give everything to Jenny on codes, but the thing that they missed among everything else was code play. And I was seeing it, my version of distinctive brand assets is codes, because I was working in fashion at the time. You could see that brands were playing with codes. So we had the Louis Vuitton monogram, and we felt it was getting a little dusty. So Marc Jacobs brought in Murakami, the Japanese pop artist, and literally the brief was, fuck around with monogram. And he produced multicolor. So monogram went white and pink and green and neon, and about 8 people in France had a stroke in the office. They were like, oh, no. There was general trauma. And yet it became our most successful collection ever. But more importantly, it was a magic trick. It looked like monogram, but it was different. It was history, but it was future. Yeah? It was heritage and it was creativity. And it was a brilliant way to bring a dusty brand back. We did the same thing with Dom Perignon. We took l'etiquette, the label, the shield, and we made it neon green. We played with the code. It was an incredible success. So the lesson was, yes, identify your palette of codes. But if they've been around, and my rule was always 40 years, fuck around with them. Invert them, twist them, change the color. Because in doing that, you keep them alive. And the weird thing, and there is a very clever word I've forgotten for this, is when you mess around with something and make it incomplete, the consumer has to complete it in their brain. And when they complete it in their brain, there's a much greater salience than if you just present it to them en masse. Here's some examples of recent years. This is my favorite. So there's a great designer in America who, this is her revisioning of the Detroit Lions. And she thought the Lions, when you hear it in Michigan, is pronounced lines. So she gave them a new logo that was more accurate to what they do, right? But they sell T-shirts now, the Detroit Lions, with these brown lines, right? But when you see the lines, you think of the Lions. Beans means more, a brilliant way to play with a 40-year-old slogan. And I hate to say it, but the work that British Rail have been doing, this is for their green initiative, it is a brilliant way to play with codes. So the idea that we should be more playful, I think, is one more contribution. Final one. 2 more to go, Bofism. So it occurred to me about 4 or 5 years ago that we are caught up in this kind of boring, binary bullshit, yeah? Long or short. Qual versus quant. Differentiation versus distinctiveness. Traditional media, digital media. Bofu, tofu. Mass marketing or targeting. DTC or wholesale. We could keep going all night. What's unusual about marketing is we're bifurcated into two things, which in almost every instance, if you put together, would be always more powerful than either option. Yeah? This is what I meant by bothism. Whenever someone's telling you differentiation is more important than distinctiveness or vice versa, just try folding them together and go, maybe I can just have both. Because that's what we've learned, right? You're better off having both channels. You're better off doing both. You're better off having full funnel. You're better off doing long and short. Qual drives quant. The reality is we should be thinking in a more generous way with and, rather in that cruel or fashion that marketing impels us to go towards. And finally, this is the one that I am most dedicated to. I'm up against a whole series of Philistines who will make incredible arguments for why universities and training make no sense in the 21st century. And whenever I encounter them, and they're everywhere, this is the only phrase that works. I believe that training in marketing, training in brand management, makes you better at marketing, makes you better at brand management. And I find it to be obvious. Despite that, I checked with LinkedIn, 28% of British marketers have training in marketing. And 12% of UK brand managers have any training in brand management. We can't do well with those kinds of numbers. Yeah? Now, if you're selling training like me, it's great news. But if you're working in the discipline, this is apocalyptic stuff, right? There's no wonder we're so shithouse at so many things because we don't know these things, because watching YouTube videos and listening to Gary Vee is not a replacement for a proper training. Okay, so let's finish. There I'm there. Okay, that's me there. So I wanted to finish with kind of the future, okay? There he is, look, there he is. So let's just do 2 minutes of the future, because I think I know what's going to happen for brand management. So I deserve more credit than Gary. So whenever there's been a new development in marketing tech in the last 10 years, Gary's all over it with Paris Hilton, and it's the future of marketing, and it's going to change everything. I have consistently and repeatedly said that's bullshit and it doesn't matter, okay? And I've historical proof of the fact, right? When everyone started banging on about influencers, I took a photograph of my bum, I pixelated it, and I paid 10 influencers to say it was a masterful work of art, right? To demonstrate that influencers would do anything for money, and it would be a largely discarded technique, which it has turned out to be. When everybody, including Gary, just lost their mind about NFTs, I made NFTs of me sitting on the toilet, and I sold them using whatever the currency was, right? Embarrassingly, I sold one of them quite a large amount of money. But anyway, my point is I've always been completely dead set against, and later right, that all of these future tech revolutions from VR to all this stuff is nonsense. I do not believe that is the case with AI. And when I say it, I get 10 times the credibility that Gary Vee gets when he says it. Yeah? I believe with AI we face a genuine revolution in how we'll do, in our case, brand management. So I work with a company called Evidenza in New York. Evidenza makes synthetic data. It's one of the leading companies in synthetic data. We've managed now to essentially remove consumers from consumer research, which is a massive relief because they were very expensive, yeah? We're focusing on B2B because you can get a sample of cheese eaters for, $4,000. But getting a sample of CEOs, CTOs, etc., it's expensive and difficult. So we're focusing there now because that's where the money is. Tony, who's the CMO of EY, got that right? Yeah, in the US, we approached Tony and said, we could do some work with you. And she sort of, in a nice way, kind of laughed at us and said, this is nonsense. So we said to Tony, you've just finished your CEO survey. We know it's taken 7 months, cost you a couple of $1 million. Send us the questions. We'll do it this afternoon, and we'll replicate your sample for you. And then we'll see. And when we sent it back to her, we were 96% the same. And we knew we were going to be 96% the same because in these 8 recent client examples where we've been given a challenge, which is work out what our consideration is, we are usually within a couple of decimal points. And as the founder of Evidenza, Pete, always says, this is as bad as AI is ever going to be. Yeah? So we're able now to generate synthetic data. What's the point of that? we don't have any ambitions to work in market research. It's a horrible business from a margin point of view, right? It sucks, as some of you who work in market research will know. This is a building block to something much bigger. So once we get synthetic data properly sorted and it's moving quickly, we move into something much more interesting, which is this. Enabling free, unlimited market research provides us with an engine for unlimited strategic tests and experiments. So what will we be able to do, and what are we already able to do in some instances, is everything a brand strategist would dream of, yeah? We can use the data to produce much more advanced segmentation and targeting advice and projections. We can use the data to do incredible relative price research beyond the ken of conjoint. We can use the data to run quasi-econometric studies without, again, the need for expensive econometric studies. We can optimize budgets. We can produce briefs. Again, this is an area we like to focus. Everyone says, well, do you think AI will ever be as good as marketers? Have you seen marketers? Yeah. I've got a beagle that's pretty close already, right? The comms mix, yeah? The category entry points. Excess share of voice estimated properly, product innovation ideas, customized funnels with conversion rates, the whole thing. And don't think of it like a 20th century human, yeah? Because imagine doing all that 4 million times, 4 million different iterations, and running them round and round and round to see what would be the optimum permutation right now to follow in terms of brand strategy. Do you remember in the Avengers, Doctor Strange works out there are 14 million scenarios to beat Thanos. There's only one that will work. Well, we can do it now. I mean, not beat Thanos. We can run millions and millions of scenarios, feeding all of those things with unlimited data, and we can produce an optimum strategy so far beyond what humans are doing, which is, as we can see, pretty dog shit at the moment. It will remove the need for human brand management. Now, we're not there yet. It's going to be a decade, yeah? I would estimate, before it properly gets democratized. But it's coming. A third of the things on that wheel are already done, yeah? And working far better than anything any humans ever produced, right? Now, if you're 55 like me, hey, the tunnel is coming before the AI thing arrives, yeah? Work with an AI firm to train the apocalypse, and then sit back and enjoy your retirement. For once, it's good to be old, yeah? But if you're 35 or under, this is an existential moment. And you're going to ask me, what should I do? And I don't know, right? I don't know. But it's going to change. And it's going to change dramatically in the decade ahead. Finally, interestingly, then there will become, obviously, automated tactical execution. Everyone's obsessed with how AI is making branding ads. I don't know why. We'll always use irrational, crazy, slightly hungover creative agencies to make incredibly creative brand-building ads. It's not that expensive compared to everything else, and humans will always win there. But where we will use automated stuff is in the hundreds of short performance messages that we need to run on a daily basis. That is going to be the first execution point, along with price and product. So the future of brand management doesn't really involve brand managers, which is an interesting way for us to conclude. I remember in 1999 where I was drinking when I had my decision to specialize on brand, which is unusual because I didn't remember very much about that evening. But I was at All Bar One near Tower Bridge, and I was having a fantastic time with half a dozen non-marketing people. And I can remember stepping back from the conversation and having that sudden realization that I was going to focus on brand for the rest of my career. And it's a decision I absolutely don't regret. Thank you.